Welcome to Mary McCorvey Experience Over Expectations podcast, which you can find on YouTube, Substack, and any place you find your podcasts. Be sure to subscribe today.
If you've ever been told to just talk to someone, please just talk to someone. Or if you feel like you've had that thought yourself, this episode is for you. Randy Taylor is the creator of There Apy, which is, if you're not here, you're there, that kind of therapy. A groundbreaking science-based alternative to traditional clinical therapy. Randy is the founder of Taylormade Leadership, one of Canada's top organizations in behavioral performance. With 35 years dedicated to the study of human behavior, Randy has spent 2 decades speaking, training, and coaching leaders on the powerful connection between neuroscience and enhanced human performance. Today, Randy's primary focus is bringing therapy to the public and says it's producing revolutionary results, often in remarkably short periods of time. So all of that sounds really good, Randy, and I'm delighted to talk with you. Thank you for coming to the program today.
Nice to be here, and congratulations to you for starting this channel and being able to bring so much information to the public. I've often said that everyone makes a living, but not everybody makes a difference, and you certainly are with this. So, congratulations.
Well, thank you very much, Randy. I really appreciate that. So, tell us more about There Apy and how you started the practice.
Yeah, so it's it's always interesting. It's a long journey to get anywhere. The overnight success typically lasts decades in order to get there. So the Coles Notes version, I've been fascinated with human behavior my entire life, having grown up in poverty and parent alcoholism, and I was homeless at age 14. So that led to kind of a fascination to say, why is it one person, ends up homeless on the streets and spends the rest of their lives there, and the next person goes on to tremendous success? So I owe part of this to a mentor early on. Age 16, my guidance counselor of the day, I quit school because I had to go and eat, tried to talk me for an hour out of leaving, and I was walking out the door, and he stopped me and he said, "I want you to know something." And I said, "What's that, sir?" And he said, I want you to know that where you are now has nothing to do with where you can go. And it wasn't a magical moment. The skies didn't part and the angels weren't singing, but he just put something in my mind that I kept going back to and thinking about over and over again. What if he's right? Right? Because he was saying, "Sorry, kid, I can't change yesterday, but it's tomorrow's up to you."
Mm-hmm.
And so I wish he was still alive. I've shared his words with hundreds of thousands of people on stages and speaking and conferences and meetings and training, and he was right. So manual labor jobs, eventually went to sales and own a couple of small businesses. I started in broadcasting at age 28 at $4.25 an hour part-time. I made it to the #1 radio station in Canada, then spent a year in television, and then 23 years ago in August, I left to form Taylormade Leadership, which has been my fascination. I've been studying human behavior for 35 years, and so worked corporately for many years, helping people, executives and people in sales and corporations to improve behavioral performance. Everybody wants that. I'm here and I want to be here. And then in the last year or so, in working with individual clients, and I've been working with executives for a long time, but started hearing more and more stories about, personal challenges that they were having. They were, it was lack of confidence or anxiety. They would be sitting at a boardroom table and their leg is shaking under the table because their anxiety is so bad. And so we started, having a lot of discussions about that, and then started researching therapy because the vast majority of people had seen a therapist. And with all of the study that I have done in science, into the science of human behavior, it just struck me that the approach was wrong. And in looking at that, I mean, in clinical therapy, what ends up happening is that we would identify, if I was the client, I had, a terrible childhood. I had that. a failed marriage, a failed business, traumas and challenges in the past. And so all the information that we take in over a lifetime is stored in files. I wear this file out in doing interviews and with clients as well, is that everything that we learn, they're put in individual files in the brain, 100 billion, brain cells or neurons, more synaptic connections than there are grains of sand on Earth. But we have all this categorization of the information. So if the file is, this is the one that taught you how to make coffee, Mary. So you can make coffee now, and you can drive your car now, and you can turn on the microphone. And there's all these things that we can do based on the storage of information in these files. However, the challenge is that this file that contains a tragic childhood or a loss of a loved one or a struggle or a trauma or a failure, that information is stored in this file as well. And the more that we think about it, the more we access it, the more we talk about it, the bigger and bigger and bigger the file gets, which ends up leading to the symptoms that people experience. It's PTSD, it's anxiety, stress, trauma, all of these things, but it's based on the information in the file. And so the approach of standard clinical therapy is to keep talking about what's in the file. And it's so interesting in the interviews that I'm doing and the clients that I'm working with, when I, go through this and explain this to them, and they go, yeah, why do they do that? Because I go to a session and I sit down and we keep talking about this tragedy from my past, and it brings it up again, and I relive it again, and I feel bad again. And the therapist talks about ways of coping with it today and how's it impacting relationships and life and all this. But it's like, don't see an elephant. If we keep talking about it, the file is going to get bigger. And so in looking at this, and then I started working with clients on a process to not focus on what's in here. So part of the process is to identify, what is in the file once, and then let it go. And then work on creating a new file with new information that is an inversion of what the past problem was. And so it's basically inverse subconscious reprogramming to be able to input the information into the subconscious mind often enough that the new file becomes dominant. That becomes the file we access, and that drives different symptoms and behaviors and choices and all the rest of it. And it's working remarkably well. I mean, all of this science has, been learned by, people probably a lot smarter than I am, but I've been a student of it for 35 years. And this application now is really helping people.
Oh, that's wonderful to hear. Everybody wants to heal. And nobody really talks about how scary it is when you start. So tell us a little bit about that. You have a different approach, but it's still scary.
It is, but it's, I think that based on, the approach that I have, the history personally that I have, that people are aware of, and I share that the way that I grew up, in parent alcoholism and suicide threats and violence and all the rest of it. I also lost a child 2 years ago. I understand, what tragedy and trauma is. And I think most importantly that, in working with people, I bring them hope, because being able to understand the science of how all this works and how all the wrong information got in the file, and a couple of practices and exercises that we go through to make everyone realize, and this is what everyone watching the show right now, here's something I want you to realize most importantly: you were born perfect. There is nothing wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with you now. And we talk in terms of mental health and mental illness and the rest of this, and that tends to label people, and then we own that. Well, I have a mental illness. But I mean, if you look at this logically and clinically, if there was an illness, there should be a pathogen, an injury, a virus. There's none of that, right? So the individual is accessing information from files from past experiences that are no longer here. And so when they start to recognize and realize the barriers that have been created in the person's life, the things that are holding them back, is based on, and this is such an incredibly important point, the recall of information from a past experience that is no longer here. And you look at that and think, I remember years and years and years ago when I was studying all of this, and I sat up late one night, and that revelation just really, really struck me, that all the things that people are giving up in life is based on something from the past. It's not now, right? If I'm struggling with anxiety, it's the recall of a trauma, of a past experience, but it's gone and it can't touch you now. And so, part of that realization, very, very important. I typically go through an exercise with clients in the beginning to have them close their eyes and then have them recall, a very traumatic past experience. And then for 2 or 3 minutes with their eyes closed, I'll talk them through it. Where were you? What was going on? Who was there? What happened in the event? What were people saying around you? What was your emotional reaction? Can you feel it right now? And within 2 or 3 minutes, people are crying, right? Because if you close your eyes, you can go there again very easily. And then I let them sit for about 30 seconds without saying anything, and then say, okay, open your eyes. And they open their eyes and they look around, and I ask them, where did it go? It's gone, right? It's gone. It has nothing to do with this moment. And that revelation of understanding as a baseline that the things that are creating all of these challenges and struggles in their life is based on a past experience that is no longer here. And so from that, there's a self-assessment form that we go through to, identify a baseline of the areas that they want to work through. Then a one-time past history evaluation to find out what's in the files. Yeah, once, and then let it go. Because if we keep talking about it, does that make sense to you, Mary? That if we keep talking about a tragedy, it's going to make it harder to get over?
Well, in some respects, yes. And I guess what I would like to know from you is continuing on the part of the pathway of healing. What I'd like to know is, what would you have told me as my therapist if I am in public completely altogether, and in private I'm falling apart? What would you tell me?
I would tell you that you are incredibly normal. We all have these two faces that we present to the world, right? I worked in broadcasting for 20 years, and it's incredible the sense that so many people in broadcasting are so outgoing, and they're so conversational, and they're so entertaining in front of a microphone in a room by yourself, doing a show, and the microphone turns off and they're paralyzed socially. They could no longer stand face to face with you and have a conversation than they could eat a turtle. They can't do it. And so that's one of the struggles, of, I think, people getting help, is that there is a stigma to it. People say, well, I'm struggling. I really have bad anxiety and depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. And, there's this stigma that, well, then there's something wrong with the person. There's not. They're just accessing information from files. That's all it is. And so dispelling that, that notion that there's something wrong with the individual, number one, and then number two, being able to absolutely 100% convince the person that they're going to get past this. There is no amount of past struggle or trauma that keeps you mired and stuck for the rest of your life. So in that situation, people who are paralyzed socially, but in public, they put on this great air. It's just the accessing of information from past files. No one was born with a doubt. And so
that's a great statement. No one was born with a doubt.
Ever. I mean, you watch a small child. My first book was called Life Before Kant. And it was a story about watching my oldest son, who's 44 now, sitting in a walker trying to pick up an apple and put it in his mouth, one of those plastic apples that roll back and forth and play music. And I watched him over and over and over again, and I became eternally fascinated. He just wouldn't quit. He tried for days and finally picked up the apple and shoved the stem in his mouth and slobbered all over it. Who hasn't wanted to do that? And in that moment, all those years ago, it dawned on me that the only reason he didn't give up trying was because no one told him he couldn't. Life before Kant. So every one of us, you, me, everyone watching this show, was born with a perfect belief system. And so the doubts that are created in our lives that create the barriers are from past experience, and they're not real, and there's nothing physical about it. And
True.
Ivan Pavlov proved in his experimentation with dogs, the salivating dogs, ring the bell, put down the food, ring the bell. The dog would eventually salivate by the bell ringing. But a lot of people were not aware that he went on in his experimentation process through something called the extinction process, where he was able to prove, this is the most important part of his study. He was able to prove that he could teach the dogs to unlearn the behavior. And that's good news for us dogs.
That is very good news.
It is very good news.
That is awesome news.
There is nothing that we cannot unlearn. Nothing. So in order to do this, I mean, the work that I do then goes into, working with the person to find out what are the barriers, right? What are the challenges? What are the things that they're being held back from, right? Are they nervous in social situations? Do they have anxiety about their relationship, about money, about flying in an airplane, right? One of the greatest examples ever. What's the safest form of travel in the world, Mary?
It's flying in an airplane.
Thank you.
Even while they're up there and the doors are falling off and the wings are
right, but
it's still the safest.
It is the safest. So statistically, you are 600 times more likely to die in your car on the way to the airport as you are in the plane. But nobody white knuckles the car, right? So what's happened is people have a bumpy flight, a bumpy landing, watched a scary movie, and they think about it over and over and over and over again. Plane's going to crash, plane's going to crash, plane's going to crash. And now they believe the lie so much, they have to go to the bar at the airport to have enough martinis to get up the courage to get on the safest form of travel in the world. And so my work then is to customize information that is consistently input on a structured basis through print and through recordings, to be able to reprogram the files in the subconscious mind to say, I love to fly. It is the safest form of travel in the world. People serve me food at 30,000 feet and I sit and relax and read a book, and then I'm in the sand 3 hours later. So, on the first few days of this programming, for the person who's afraid to fly, they're going to think that's a bunch of bunk. Eventually, the brain cannot distinguish the input of intentional information from an experience. And so it will eventually drive you to believe the truth that the plane's not going to crash.
Well, I have another question, and it goes to helping people understand what it is that they're dealing with when they don't understand, and whether a diagnosis might be important. So, for example, you are not broken. You're responding to something that no one helped you name. And in what you're saying, I'm hearing is you've got it in the file, right? So, for example, in my particular case, I had severe PTSD when I came back from the Middle East after serving in the Gulf War.
Yeah.
And I didn't understand what was happening. I was already getting ill while I was there. And I got more and more sick as time went on, and there was no diagnosis for it. And so, along with that came depression, came anxiety,
Yeah.
in a severe state. And so, what I learned later, but it was many years later, is that we were exposed to sarin nerve gas. And that's what was causing that was what was causing the illness. But at this, and continues to this day to cause the illness. But at the time and in between times, there was no way of diagnosing what the heck was wrong. So, on top of experiencing the symptoms, I also experienced the inability to point at something and say, well, I've got a kidney problem, I've got a kidney stone, or something. It was the ambiguity around it that made it so difficult. One of the things that made it so difficult. What do you think about that?
So, two very, very important and distinct differences. Your trauma from the Gulf War, was part of it the psychological horror of that?
You're asking me that question?
Yeah.
No, no, it
So
was not. So I did not in the Gulf War. We essentially took care of business very quickly. So there were not a lot of casualties, and I did not experience combat in that regard. I had environmental exposure to sarin nerve gas. But the implications of that and the what happened to me physically from that, and then emotionally and mentally, that's what really was very, very difficult over a period of time.
There is no question. So, I mean, typically, post-traumatic stress disorder with most of the troops that come home is as a result of the horrors of war that they ended up experiencing. Yours is a chemical exposure that they didn't know and or diagnose, which left you feeling that you were broken and there was something wrong with you.
That's correct.
Right. So on 2 points. One, I don't subscribe to labeling people. I wouldn't label what you had or have is post-traumatic stress disorder. It's a poisoning. I mean, it's a neurotoxin that you were poisoned with that caused all of the subsequent health issues. And then obviously the psychological issues that went from no one being able to name what happened to you. And so you just felt like you were broken and there was something wrong with you, correct?
Yes, I will push back a little bit and say I did have PTSD, and I had it in a severe way. It stole 4 of my years of life right off the bat, and took many more years to reconcile. It
But
was, I'm
I guess
sorry.
that's where I'm kind of confused about the labeling. Post-traumatic stress disorder, yours was chemical. It was not emotional and psychological, right? It became that because it made you very ill, obviously. And there's an absolute correlation between those two. But PTSD is typically psychologically connected.
Oh, this is a very, very interesting part of the conversation, because where I'd like to go, Randy,
Yeah.
is I'd like to go to a situation that happened with you that was not something that you could control, right? And it was something that you could, what a horrible experience that one of your children died.
Yeah.
Okay, that caused PTS as far as I can tell, and I'm certainly not someone who has studied human behavior for 35 years, but if I lost my daughter, it would cause me PTS. And so I guess maybe I'm having difficulty with I did not experience PTS just because mine was a chemical exposure, or perhaps you didn't experience PTS when your child died, but that's because I'm a little lost in this.
Okay, so the chemical exposure is over here. It's on its own, right? So it is a neurotoxin. It made you very sick. No one was able to tell you what happened to you. All you knew was that you were having bouts of depression and probably anxiety and self-loathing and all kinds of terrible emotional reaction to it. But it was to the chemical, not to an event. Losing my daughter was, of course, just it's so unnatural. When you and I die, it will be sad. When you lose a child, it's a tragedy.
Yes, it certainly is.
Because there was supposed to be so many more years. And so did I suffer horribly when she died? Of course. Has the understanding of all of the science of this helped me to be able to go on with my life and be able to, to understand what this is and how to move past it? Yes, absolutely. Is the death of my child the same for someone else who, went through an incredibly traumatic breakup of a marriage? Yes. I mean, everyone's, emotional trauma is their emotional trauma. But again, when my daughter died, nothing happened to me physically. Okay. So I all of a sudden had a file that said, here's your daughter's life. And now it includes her death. And you're never going to see her again. And you're never going to hold her hand again. And you're never going to do all those things again. And so it's psychological trauma. There was no injury. So when we call something PTSD or multiple anxiety disorder, I work with people that have been diagnosed with those things, then we label it, right? And somebody would say, Randy has PTSD. No, I had a tragedy. And that information is stored in a file. And if I don't deal with that and go on and make new files, it very well could dominate me and ruin the rest of my life, mired in sadness and depression and anxiety and all the rest of that. So again, it's not an injury. Yours was a physical injury, which is unique to PTSD. I have, and I'm talking about this from great experience, Matt, a client of mine who reached out a number of months ago, saw something that a reel I put online, and he watched it, and he had been struggling his whole life with what was termed to be PTSD. He was raised by an abusive mother, stuck a pen in his leg at 3 years old, taken away by Children's Aid, put in foster homes, beaten and abused until he was 18, then went into the armed services, went to Afghanistan, and all his friends were blown up in front of him. So 20 years he had been in therapy every week, sometimes twice, and canceled the session 3 times before he actually came on, and said he didn't believe anything and it never worked for him and it never made him better. He was living like a hoarder. And that was about 5 months ago. And I could show you the video that he sent me last week of his new place that he just moved into in Panama.
Well, that sounds like a wonderful success story. I'm still confused about the psychological and the physical. So I know that, many of as an Army veteran and working with a lot of military veterans that came back post 9/11 and had severe injuries, they had PTS and they had to and are continuing to strive to overcome that. I actually did a television program called The Triumph Games, and we produced stories about those that had suffered catastrophic injury. And they talked about PTS and how it was important for them to be able to get their head around okay, what they were experiencing. And I guess maybe I do have a little difficult time with the idea that because it was physical, it wasn't PTS. But we can move on from there. Um, so one of your clients says, when I thought the anxiety would never end, I tried something no one talks about, therapy. What did they experience? You were just
Uh,
talking with your client, Matt, about that.
right. So is that a quote from Matt?
No, it's a question for me.
But was it a quote from one of my clients or?
No, no, no. Okay, it's a question that, I was posing a rhetorical situation.
Okay, I'm sorry.
So,
I was trying to think in my head of who it was you were talking about.
oh
So
no, 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 no problem. No
read
problem.
it again.
Excuse me?
You read it again, what you said?
Sure. Sure. So imagine this. One of your clients says, when I thought the anxiety would never end, I tried something no one talks about, therapy. Tell us what that person experienced.
Um, kind of getting their life back. I think, listen, I've had a wonderful life. You know where I came from. I have worked for some of the biggest corporations in North America. I've stood on stage at Sky Dome in Toronto speaking in front of 50,000 people. This is the most rewarding work I've ever done.
I can imagine.
When you see someone that on the first day, they only see walls
Right.
and limitations and they're broken and many times they don't want to be here. To hear the words from someone, I just think it's better if I kill myself. I take that incredibly seriously, but I also
Yes.
know they're not stuck. So
Mhm.
when someone goes through this process and gets to a point where they start to see their life unfolding again and those barriers begin to lift and they start to have emotions. I mean, people can become so psychologically damaged by this. Not that it's not, repairable. It is, but it feels like it's not. They're never going
I
to
know
laugh,
what that feels like.
never going to laugh again, never going to love again. They're never going to look forward to eating ice cream. It's like, and when that starts to lift, and then also understanding the science that all of the work they did to get there isn't just a hypothetical, right? So they did the work to create a new file that, I mean, it's interesting from a scientific perspective. Every thought we have and every action we take, we in a millisecond instantly go inside, open the files from the subconscious mind to say, what do we know about it? So if I go to pick up my water, right, as I did that, I had to open a file in my brain that said, how do you pick up water? And four fingers on one side and thumb on the other side, and careful because it's weighted, and right. So all of that information that's in the file allowed me to pick up water. And so what's in the wrong files that are causing all of these issues for people, they know and understand when they have actually succeeded in creating a new file that becomes dominant over the last. When they have an action, they're not triggered by the old file. Does that make sense?
Yes, it absolutely does.
If I had a conversation with a lady last week and she said, I get triggered all the time. Every time I see a guy with blonde hair and curly hair, it's this relationship that I was in for years and it was abusive and horrible. And so just the sight of blonde hair triggers her, right? But over time, the new file will no longer cause her to be triggered by blonde hair because the new file will eventually, within, and not, Matt was in therapy for 20 years. I've had other clients 9 years in therapy over a fairly reasonable period of time, 3, 4, 5 months. And they've created a new file that is dominant enough to replace the old one.
What do you say to the woman who's done everything quote unquote right and still wakes up feeling anxious, empty, or stuck?
They haven't done everything. I mean, honestly, and I feel bad for people who have done so much, who have spent so much money, who have tried so hard over so many years. It's not their fault, right? They're doing the right thing. There are 65 million people right now in North America in clinical therapy. And listen, I'm not here to throw therapists under the bus. I'm here to suggest to you that this kid that grew up homeless through all of this whole journey ended up finding a solution to something that helps people to get past this.
Mm-hmm.
And 80% of the clients I work with have been in clinical therapy before, and it didn't work, right? It didn't. And this is, and I'm not telling you that so I get more clients. I'm telling you that so I give people hope that they have done all the right things, and it hasn't happened yet, but it can. So
Absolutely. Thank you. So many of us are taught to cope, but not to heal.
correct.
And you're talking about healing. What is the difference between those two? And how can we tell which one we're doing? What happens when we start making new files?
Then you stop accessing the old one. So you can tell because the thought process is going to begin to change. It's interesting you talk about coping, because that is the approach typically of a lot of clinical therapy. We'll find ways for you to cope with the loss of your daughter. We'll find ways for you to cope with what happened in war or a broken marriage or whatever it was, right? But one of the interesting things about the subconscious mind is that it can't differentiate between the actual information and intention. So if I said to you, gosh, Mary, I woke up 2 weeks ago and I said, you know what, that's enough. I'm tired of being broke, and I'm tired of being in debt. And I'm going to tell myself every day, I'm never going to be in debt again. The only thing the subconscious mind hears is debt, right? So if I'm finding coping mechanisms to get out of debt, the brain just keeps hearing debt. And so what we need to do is program the mind to say, I am driven every day to attract and work towards and accomplish tremendous prosperity. Now the old debt file starts to starve. And from a scientific perspective, I mean, the larger the file and the neural pathway, the number of cells in the cluster gets greater and greater and greater, the more information we put into it. Conversely, when you stop accessing it as much that way, the synapses begin to let go, and the number of cells in the cluster diminish, and the file begins to become less and less dominant. And then we input a new file that through an intentional process, then becomes the dominant file.
Tell me in 30 seconds or less, describe There Apy for me.
There Apy is a process to be able to have people identify past struggles and traumas and work to create a new file to replace the old dominant file that is creating all the problems and stress and anxiety and struggle in their lives. And it is an intentional process. It does take work on behalf of the client. It works every time. Mary, I haven't had anybody this hasn't helped. So I'm excited about it.
That is wonderful. Well, thank you for being on the program today, Randy. We really appreciate it. And how can people be in touch with you? How can they reach out?
Sure. So for people who want to, learn more about this, discuss their own issues, the first session is at no cost. I want people to feel like, they feel like I'm a fit for them. So you can go to the website. It's freefromtherapy.com. And there's a link there. You can schedule and book a free first session, and then it's a conversation, and we'll take it from there. I know you deal with a lot of veterans. If there's any veterans I can't imagine what some of them have been through, but I truly believe that there is a way out, and I certainly would welcome any conversations with veterans to talk about their experiences, and hopefully this can give them some light to be able to find a way out of it.
Well, thank you very much, Randy. And I will say, because it continues to be a staggering statistic, 22 veterans every day commit suicide.
So,
and this is, well after the wars have ended, so to speak.
Yeah.
The wars still continue in the Middle East, but Afghanistan and Iraq have calmed down a little bit. So I would be glad to put them in touch with you. And I thank you for all of the work that you do to help others. And that's a very laudable way to live. And thank you again for being on the program.
Great to be here, Mary. I really appreciate it. Have a wonderful day. Let me know if there's anything else I can help with in the future.
Thank you.
Take care.
You've been listening to Mary McCorvey's Experience Over Expectations podcast. Be sure to subscribe today on YouTube and Substack, or listen wherever you find your podcasts. Thanks for tuning in.